They called it royal blood, but what flowed through Europe's most powerful veins was anything but pure. It was poisoned by pride, by fear, and by centuries of cousins marrying cousins. Today, marrying your first cousin would raise eyebrows, maybe even get you disinvited from Thanksgiving. But in royal courts, it was a strategy, a sacred duty. Keep the bloodline clean, even if it meant birthing heirs who drooled, seized, and screamed through the night. One Habsburg king couldn't chew food without choking. Another had a jaw so deformed it dragged when he spoke. Some couldn't walk, others couldn't rule, but they wore crowns anyway. You were taught these were the chosen ones, God's anointed, the rightful rulers. For centuries, Europe's royal families thought they were preserving divine bloodlines through strategic marriages. What they actually created was a genetic horror show that would make a modern genealogist weep into their family tree software. Today, we're exploring how the obsession with pure blood produced some spectacularly impure results. Charles II of Spain couldn't close his mouth properly, spoke unintelligibly through constant drooling, and required his food to be mashed like baby food. This wasn't some tragic accident. This was 4 centuries of Habsburg strategic breeding coming home to roost. The Habsburg jaw wasn't just a family trait. It was the physical manifestation of Europe's most ambitious genetic experiment. Charles's family tree was so twisted it looked more like a pretzel, with ancestors appearing multiple times in positions that would make a modern geneticist reach for anxiety medication. His parents shared more DNA than many siblings, producing a coefficient of inbreeding that would make laboratory mice look diverse. The infamous Habsburg lip and jaw, once considered marks of divine royal blood, had become so extreme that Charles could barely perform basic human functions. He couldn't chew properly, struggled to speak coherently, and spent most meals having servants pre-mash his food into a royal paste. Because nothing says divinely chosen ruler quite like needing someone to pre-chew your dinner. But wait, it gets better. Charles's physical challenges were just the appetizer in this genetic feast of consequences. He didn't speak until he was 4, couldn't walk until 8, and spent his entire life dealing with a body that seemed designed by a committee of chromosomes that had stopped communicating with each other. His medical history reads like a textbook of recessive genetic disorders having a party. The Spanish Habsburg branch of the family had spent 2 centuries carefully crafting this genetic masterpiece through a dedicated program of marrying cousins, aunts, uncles, basically anyone who shared their distinctive chin. By the time Charles was born, his family tree had fewer branches than a telephone pole. His father was his mother's uncle. Yes, you read that correctly. His grandmother was also his aunt. Family reunions must have been wonderfully uncomplicated. Everyone was already there. The irony, this genetic bottleneck was entirely intentional. The Habsburgs thought they were preserving something precious, their divine right to rule, manifested in their distinctive features. Instead, they created a ruler who could barely govern his own body, let alone an empire. Charles died at 38, mercifully ending the Spanish Habsburg line and proving that even evolution has its limits. Because when you spend 200 years deliberately crafting the world's most circular family tree, nature eventually sends you a bill. And in Charles's case, that bill came with a jaw that needed its own foreign policy. Egyptian pharaohs practiced sibling marriage for 30 centuries straight, believing it preserved their divine essence, the longest-running genetic experiment in human history. The Ptolemaic dynasty took this family tradition to spectacular new heights. Cleopatra VII, the famous last pharaoh, married both her younger brothers in succession, keeping things neatly in the family. Because apparently, regular marriage wasn't complicated enough without adding, "My husband is also my brother," to the mix. This wasn't just some brief, ill-advised trend. We're talking about 3,000 years of systematic sibling marriage, maintained with the kind of dedication that would make a modern geneticist cry into their research papers. The practice was so institutionalized that Pharaohs who married outside the family were considered the weird ones. The results were exactly what you'd expect when you spend 30 centuries ignoring basic biology. Archaeological evidence from royal mummies reads like a medical textbook of genetic disorders. Increased infant mortality, physical deformities, and cognitive issues that got worse with each generation. But hey, at least they kept that divine bloodline pure, right? The Ptolemaic dynasty, founded by one of Alexander the Great's generals, took this ancient tradition and ran with it. They maintained power through what was essentially a family reunion that lasted for 3 centuries. Their family tree became so twisted that modern genealogy software actually crashes trying to map it. Yes, you read that correctly. Their family relationships were literally too complicated for computers to handle. Modern DNA analysis of royal mummies shows the predictable consequences. Chromosomal abnormalities that would make a genetics professor use their research papers as tissues. Multiple generations suffered from physical ailments that made ruling an empire significantly more challenging than it needed to be. But they persisted because nothing says divine right to rule quite like deliberately breeding genetic disorders into your dynasty. The truly fascinating part? This wasn't some secret shame. They were proud of it. Royal propaganda celebrated these unions as proof of their divine status. Imagine bragging about something that modern science uses as a cautionary tale. That's commitment to a concept. The practice created such a genetic bottleneck that by the later dynasties, pharaohs were more closely related to their siblings than modern lab mice are to each other. Their family trees didn't branch. They curved back on themselves like some sort of botanical Mobius strip. But perhaps the most ironic part was that this system, designed to preserve power, often achieved the opposite. Weak rulers, shortened lifespans, and fertility problems repeatedly threatened the very dynasties they were trying to perpetuate. Because it turns out that ignoring basic genetics for 3,000 years isn't the best strategy for long-term dynastic success. And speaking of genetic consequences, wait until you hear about King Tutankhamun's walking stick collection. Because nothing says powerful pharaoh quite like needing 130 walking sticks to get around your own palace. King Tutankhamun owned 130 walking sticks, had a severe club foot, a cleft palate, and died at 19 after a reign marked by physical frailty. This wasn't just bad luck. This was genetics coming home to roost in spectacular fashion. DNA analysis of Tut's mummy revealed his parents were full siblings, making him more inbred than children born to first cousins. And boy, did it show. The boy king's tomb contained more medical aids than a modern pharmacy. Along with those 130 walking sticks, they found specialized chairs, canes, and items that paint a picture of someone who could barely function without constant support. Think about that. A teenager who needed more mobility aids than a retirement home. His mummy tells a story that royal propaganda tried to hide. Evidence shows he suffered from bone necrosis, multiple congenital disorders, and a body so weakened that a minor leg fracture likely led to his death. The mighty pharaoh, divine ruler of Egypt, couldn't even walk properly without assistance. CT scans of his remains revealed a club foot so severe he would have needed those walking sticks just to stay upright. His cleft palate would have affected his speech, and evidence suggests he had epilepsy, because apparently, one genetic disorder wasn't enough. This wasn't the image of divine kingship that Egyptian art portrayed. Tomb paintings show Tut as a mighty warrior, charging into battle on his chariot. The reality? He could barely mount a horse, let alone lead armies. Most of those hunting scenes depicted on his tomb walls were about as historically accurate as a Hollywood movie poster. The stark contrast between propaganda and reality becomes almost darkly comic. Here was ancient Egypt's most famous pharaoh, surrounded by images of himself as a powerful ruler, while in reality he was struggling just to make it through a normal day. His golden throne had to be specially modified, just so he could sit comfortably. But perhaps the most ironic part, his early death probably saved him from even worse health problems. The cocktail of genetic disorders he inherited was a ticking time bomb. Had he lived longer, he likely would have developed even more serious conditions. Ancient Egypt's divine bloodlines had produced a ruler who embodied every warning about inbreeding that modern genetics could provide. Because nothing says chosen by the gods quite like needing a small army of walking aids to get around your own palace. And if you think Tut had it bad, wait until you hear about Britain's maddest king, whose genetic inheritance turned him into a one-man medical mystery show. King George III's famous madness coincided perfectly with 4 generations of his family marrying German relatives, creating a genetic bottleneck that would make a population biologist wince. The king who lost America wasn't just fighting colonial rebels. He was battling his own DNA. His great-great-grandfather, great-grandfather, grandfather, and father all married within the same narrow pool of Germanic royalty, treating their family tree more like a family wreath. Modern analysis suggests his erratic behavior matched perfectly with porphyria, a genetic disorder that gets amplified by inbreeding. This condition turned his urine purple and triggered episodes of mental instability that could last for months. Picture trying to run an empire while experiencing hallucinations, severe abdominal pain, and conversations with trees, because that's exactly what George was doing. The symptoms first appeared in 1765, right around the time tensions with the American colonies were heating up. During his worst episodes, he would talk until he foamed at the mouth, sometimes speaking for hours without pause. Court physicians recorded him chatting with dead relatives and mistaking a tree for the King of Prussia, which must have made diplomatic relations interesting. The most famous portrait of his madness came during a particularly severe episode in 1788, when he greeted an oak tree as though it were an old friend and proceeded to have an extended conversation about politics with it. Because apparently when you're the king, nobody tells you trees don't usually have strong opinions about foreign policy. His condition got progressively worse over time, with episodes lasting longer and becoming more severe. By 1810, he was permanently incapacitated, leading Parliament to establish his son as Prince Regent. The mighty King George III, ruler of the British Empire, spent his final decade in isolation at Windsor Castle, blind, deaf, and lost in his own mind. The tragic irony? This genetic time bomb was entirely preventable. Had the British royal family occasionally married someone who wasn't their German cousin, George might have kept both his sanity and his American colonies. His reign became a masterclass in how inherited disorders can shape history. His mental state affected everything from colonial policy to domestic reforms. Those famous moments we all learn about in history class, his stubborn handling of the American Revolution, the loss of the colonies, the constitutional crisis during his periods of incapacity, all take on new meaning when viewed through the lens of genetic inheritance. The king wasn't just being obstinate. He was literally not in his right mind. And speaking of minds warped by royal inbreeding, wait until you meet Alfonso XII of Spain, whose family tree was so twisted it made George III's look positively diverse by comparison. Alfonso XII of Spain's parents, Queen Isabella II and Francisco de Assis, shared so much DNA that geneticists use his family as a textbook example of inbreeding depression. The Spanish Bourbons had created a genetic echo chamber that would make a clone factory look diverse. After 3 centuries of marrying within the same handful of royal houses, they'd achieved an inbreeding coefficient of 0.254, higher than what you'd get from full siblings deciding to have kids together. Yes, you read that correctly. This royal family was more inbred than actual incest. Alfonso's family tree looked less like a tree and more like bamboo, straight up with no branches. His ancestors had recycled the same genes so many times that drawing his lineage required special notation just to keep track of how many ways each person was related to themselves. Because apparently, when you run out of cousins to marry, you just start over with the same cousins. The results were exactly what you'd expect when you play genetic roulette with loaded dice. Alfonso lived just 27 years, battling a constant parade of illnesses that his immune system, compromised by generations of copy-paste genetics, couldn't handle. His children inherited what was essentially a genetic lottery, where every ticket was a loser. Medical records from his reign read like a cautionary tale about population bottlenecks. The Spanish court physicians kept detailed accounts of his health struggles, probably because they needed to justify why their king spent more time in bed than on his throne. The official cause of death was tuberculosis, but that's like saying a house collapsed because of a strong breeze. Technically true, but missing the whole foundation made of sand part. The most fascinating part. This wasn't some medieval disaster. Alfonso died in 1885. The Spanish Bourbons were achieving unprecedented levels of genetic uniformity right when Darwin was publishing about the importance of diversity in natural selection, while the scientific world was discovering the dangers of inbreeding. European royalty was treating it like an Olympic sport. But wait until you hear about Queen Victoria. She managed to turn genetic disaster into an art form, spreading one particularly nasty mutation across every royal house in Europe like a very exclusive plague. Queen Victoria carried a genetic mutation that turned her descendants into walking time bombs, spreading hemophilia across European royalty like a medieval plague. Her genetic gift to Europe's royal houses was a mutation that prevented blood from clotting properly, because apparently regular inheritance wasn't dramatic enough. While she showed no symptoms herself, Victoria was a carrier who passed this lovely party favor to 3 of her children and numerous grandchildren. The grandmother of Europe earned her nickname through an aggressive marriage strategy that placed her descendants on thrones across the continent. 9 of her children married into royal families, carrying the recessive gene like a royal welcome gift. Think of it as history's most ambitious family reunion, but with added bleeding disorders. Victoria's daughters became genetic sleeper agents. Princess Alice passed it to the Russian royal family. Princess Beatrice delivered it to Spain. Princess Victoria spread it to Prussia. By 1900, the mutation had infiltrated nearly every major European dynasty, because nothing says divine right to rule like a bloodline that literally can't stop bleeding. The timing couldn't have been worse. Just as medical science was advanced enough to identify hemophilia but not treat it effectively, Europe's royal houses were playing musical thrones with carriers. Every minor injury became a potential crisis. Royal physicians spent more time monitoring clotting times than checking for poison, a remarkable shift in palace medicine. By 1914, European royalty was so interconnected that World War I was essentially a family feud with hemophiliac casualties. Kaiser Wilhelm II, King George V, and Tsar Nicholas II, all Victoria's grandchildren, led their nations into war while sharing not just DNA, but also a potentially lethal genetic mutation. But the most dramatic impact wasn't on Victoria's male descendants who had the disease. It was through her daughters who carried it. These royal women became unwitting genetic ambassadors, creating a network of carriers that would ultimately help topple empires. Just ask the Romanovs, whose desperate attempts to treat their hemophiliac heir led them straight to Rasputin. Tsarevich Alexei Romanov's hemophilia, inherited from his great-great-grandmother Victoria, brought down the 300-year-old Russian Empire through sheer biological irony. The last heir to the Russian throne spent his childhood wrapped in cotton wool, literally. Every bump, bruise, or scrape could trigger internal bleeding that kept him bedridden for weeks. His parents, Tsar Nicholas II and Alexandra, watched helplessly as their only son writhed in agony from injuries that would barely affect normal children. This wasn't just any medical condition. It was a ticking time bomb at the heart of Europe's largest empire. The Romanovs had survived centuries of threats, from Napoleon to revolutionaries, only to be undone by a single genetic mutation that prevented blood clotting. Because apparently, divine right to rule doesn't include divine right to functional platelets. Enter Grigory Rasputin, the infamous mad monk who could somehow ease Alexei's suffering when modern medicine failed. The political consequences were devastating. While Nicholas II should have been focusing on running his massive empire, he was distracted by his son's constant health crises. Alexandra, consumed by maternal anxiety, increasingly relied on Rasputin's advice, not just for medical issues, but for state affairs. The monk effectively became a shadow ruler, appointing ministers and making policy decisions while the actual government fell into chaos. Russian society watched in horror as this unwashed peasant wielded more power than career statesmen. Aristocrats plotted against him, the church denounced him, and the public whispered about his influence over the empress. When he was finally murdered in 1916, the damage to the Romanovs' reputation was irreparable. The revolution of 1917 emerged from many factors: war exhaustion, economic collapse, social unrest. But the catalyst was the royal family's complete loss of credibility, largely due to their dependence on a mystic who gained access through a genetic disorder. The mighty Romanov dynasty, which had ruled Russia for 3 centuries, was ultimately undermined by a single recessive gene. The final irony? In their last months, imprisoned by the Bolsheviks, the family had to watch Alexei suffer without even Rasputin's questionable help. The dynasty that survived Napoleon, multiple wars, and peasant uprisings was ultimately defeated by the inability to clot blood. One genetic mutation, passed down through Queen Victoria's female line, had helped topple an empire. Because sometimes the biggest threats to power don't come from external enemies, but from your own family tree. King Carlos I of Portugal achieved a coefficient of inbreeding that modern geneticists use as a cautionary tale, with his family tree containing more loops than a roller coaster. Let's talk numbers for a moment. Most humans have a coefficient of inbreeding close to 0. First cousins, about 0.0625. Carlos I, a staggering 0.254, meaning he was more inbred than the offspring of siblings. Modern lab rats specifically bred for genetic uniformity look at these numbers and wince. How does one achieve such spectacular genetic uniformity? Start with parents who were double first cousins, meaning they shared both sets of grandparents. Yes, you read that correctly. The Portuguese Braganza dynasty had spent generations playing genetic musical chairs with the same Spanish and Austrian royal houses, creating a family tree that looks more like a pretzel. This wasn't just bad luck or poor planning. The Braganzas systematically married their closest relatives for centuries, treating genetic diversity like a disease to be avoided. Each generation somehow managed to find marriage partners even more closely related than the last, as if they were competing for some sort of anti-diversity award. The results were exactly what you'd expect. Carlos struggled with various health issues throughout his life, though he managed to rule for 16 years before being assassinated in 1908. The assassins probably needn't have bothered. His genetic legacy suggests natural selection was already working on a solution. Here's the truly mind-bending part. Carlos's coefficient of inbreeding was so extreme that modern population geneticists still cite his family in academic papers. When your family tree becomes a case study in genetic bottlenecking, you know you've achieved something special. His lineage is literally taught in universities as an example of what not to do with your gene pool. The Portuguese royal family had essentially created their own isolated genetic island in the middle of Europe. Ancient Egypt's pharaohs maintained sibling marriage for over 3 millennia, creating the longest documented genetic experiment in human history with predictably horrifying results. Think about that for a moment. 3,000 years of brothers marrying sisters, generation after generation. This wasn't some brief dynastic quirk. This was a systematic practice that lasted longer than most modern countries have existed. From the Old Kingdom through the Ptolemaic period, royal siblings routinely married each other to preserve divine bloodlines. The practice was so normalized that when pharaohs occasionally married non-siblings, chroniclers treated it like a shocking break from tradition. Because apparently, marrying someone who didn't share your parents was considered the weird choice. The archaeological evidence reads like a medical horror story. Royal mummies show increased rates of infant mortality, skeletal deformities, and shortened lifespans across multiple dynasties. CT scans of pharaonic remains reveal a greatest hits collection of genetic disorders: cleft palates, club feet, scoliosis, and various developmental issues that would make a modern geneticist cry. But wait, it gets better. The practice was so institutionalized that they built their entire religious ideology around it. The gods themselves were portrayed as divine siblings who married each other, effectively making incest a sacred duty for the pharaohs who claimed to be their earthly incarnations. By the time the Ptolemaic dynasty took over, they inherited this tradition and thought, yes, this seems reasonable, despite being Greeks who should have known better. Cleopatra VII, the dynasty's last ruler, married both her younger brothers in succession, because apparently one brother husband wasn't enough to maintain those divine genetics. The result? A genetic bottleneck so severe that modern isolated island populations show more diversity. We're talking about a level of inbreeding that would make European royalty look like random strangers at a bus stop. The pharaohs had effectively created their own genetic isolation experiment, running for 3 times longer than recorded English history. Scientists studying royal mummies have found evidence of increased genetic disorders with each successive generation, exactly what you'd expect when you're playing chromosomal Russian roulette for 3,000 years straight. The divine bloodline became increasingly prone to physical deformities, cognitive issues, and various health problems that no amount of divine intervention could fix. Modern genetics tells us that this level of sustained inbreeding should have been catastrophic, and the archaeological evidence confirms it absolutely was. The pharaohs managed to create a genetic disaster that lasted longer than some religions, all in the name of keeping their bloodline pure. Because nothing says chosen by the gods like 3,000 years of chromosomal Russian roulette. Up next, how European royalty looked at this cautionary tale and somehow thought, challenge accepted. Modern DNA analysis reveals that European royal families achieved less genetic diversity than populations stranded on remote islands for centuries, turning continental empires into genetic islands through sheer determination. Think about that for a moment. People literally trapped on tiny islands in the middle of nowhere had more genetic variety than the rulers of vast empires spanning multiple continents. That takes real commitment to terrible breeding practices. The Habsburgs, Bourbons, Romanovs, and Windsors created an interconnected web of relationships so Byzantine that World War I was literally just cousins fighting cousins over territorial disputes. When your family tree is so tangled that global warfare becomes a family feud with artillery, you might have a problem. But wait, it gets better. These strategic alliances effectively turned Europe's ruling class into the human equivalent of purebred dogs. Impressive pedigrees, multiple health problems, and a disturbing tendency toward mental instability. Just like how modern dog breeds suffer from specific genetic issues, each royal house developed their own signature defects. The Habsburgs had their jaw, the Romanovs carried hemophilia, and the Spanish Bourbons collected every recessive trait they could find. The genetic bottleneck became so severe that by the 19th century, royal DNA diversity approached levels typically seen in endangered species. Yes, you read that correctly. The supposed pinnacle of human civilization had managed to breed themselves into the same genetic corner as animals on the brink of extinction. These divine bloodlines had successfully preserved their pure blood by ensuring there wasn't much genetic variety left to preserve. It's like they were playing a centuries-long game of genetic Jenga, removing one healthy gene at a time until the whole structure inevitably collapsed. The irony is almost perfect. In their obsessive quest to maintain power through strategic marriages, Europe's royal families created the very conditions that would make effective leadership impossible. They literally bred themselves into extinction, proving that nature really does have a sense of humor about human pride. So the next time someone romanticizes the good old days of monarchy, remind them that these divine bloodlines produced rulers who couldn't eat, walk, or think properly. Centuries of genetic purity created leaders who needed walking sticks to stand and monks to make basic decisions. Turns out democracy, genetic diversity, and marrying outside your immediate family tree were rather brilliant ideas after all. Who knew?